Hey everybody, welcome to Coffee with Joe for September 23rd, 2009. This is a weekly web chat between myself, Pete Young in Plainfield, Vermont, and Joe Bongiovanni in Harborton, Virginia, that we do for the website economicstability.org. If you've been around this site very much, you know that the Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air and trades it to the US Treasury for Treasury securities, which are promises to pay back the amount borrowed from the Fed with interest. They're allowed to deduct their expenses from their income, and any net income they have over and above that amount at the end of the year, they contribute back to the US Treasury. I mean, if they hung on to it, you might be able to call them a parasitic organization, but they contribute their profits back to the US Treasury. And yet monetary reformers criticize the Fed and they say it's a parasitic organization.
It's not really written into the law anymore that they have to make that payment. Okay. When the Federal Reserve Act was first drafted, was first written and enacted, the excess earnings, what we might call net income, of the Fed was identified as a franchise tax to the Federal Reserve banking system, okay, and had to be paid back, in fact, to the Treasury. One of the revisions along the way, the franchise tax provision was repealed, and there was a fairly extended period of time when, in fact, they did not return their net earnings to the Treasury. So we have a practice now that, in fact, they do. Even that's not really required, okay? So we have to take a look at it and say, well, how much are we getting back, first of all? What percentage of what we're paying are we getting back? What percentage of it could go for things like losses that could be incurred by the various, I call them new open window transactions of TALF and TAF and various acronyms of new programs that have been providing trillions of dollars into these programs that are guaranteed. So if they have losses, what happens? And plus, again, some of the things that are happening right now, the investment banks pretty much going bust, Pete, getting stuck with their 50 to 1, 40 to 1, 30 to 1 leveraging, deciding that, in fact, being an investment bank is not a good thing, so they form additional holding companies and become commercial banks. And the Fed lets them in. There's not really a hard and fast rule as to who should be a commercial bank, who can be a commercial bank. They buy up a small, failing commercial bank, and now you have huge investment banks that are at the window of the Fed. The Fed's providing money to them, and they're carrying on their securitization practices. So we have all these things that are risking the net income of the Fed, okay? And what happens if the Fed loses money?
Last year's Fed payment to the US Treasury was $31 billion.
$31 billion now
for 2008.
So you have a situation where, with trillions of new loans out there, what happens if they lose 31 billion? I don't know if I can call up this speech that Federal Reserve Vice Chair Donald Cohn gave to the Brookings Institute last week, in which he was trying to explain how the Fed was okay with all of its various, not only its lending programs, but its positions that it's taking. But he did raise, for the first time, as far as I can see, even the unlikely event that a sharp rise in interest rates forced us to suspend remittances to the Treasury temporarily. Now, Pete, that's a huge taxpayer burden right there. But listen to how he finished out this sentence. He says, even in that unlikely event, and if we were forced to suspend remittances to the Treasury so the 31 billion goes to zero, question is, does it go to negative? We would still maintain our ability to implement monetary policy to foster our statutory objectives, which are full employment and price stability. The key here is that what he was really defending, Pete, was the ability for the Fed to continue to provide funding to the securities markets, to the securities industry. Okay, and how is it doing that? It's doing that by taking some of those toxic assets from the securities industry and onto its books, onto our books. If you thought of the Federal Reserve as if it was public, but because its losses will be publicized,
its losses will be public.
Okay. So it wants to have the ability to continue to lend to the securities industry. So right there, you have, for the first time I'm aware of anywhere, Pete, any Fed official stating that it may be necessary to temporarily suspend those remittances to the Treasury. So let's follow that through. 31 billion last year. That 31 billion is not going to go to the Treasury. What's the Treasury going to do to balance its revenues and expenses? Where are they going to get it, Pete? And the answer is they're going to get it from the Fed. They're going to go back to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is going to create $31 billion out of nothing, lend it to the Treasury, so the Treasury issues another certificate back to the Fed. The Fed holds that certificate, and we pay interest on that money. So we're going to pay interest on the money that we already paid interest on. And we're going to do that so that the Federal Reserve can lend money to the securities industry, which caused a huge part of this whole financial collapse. And we contrast that, we contrast this private cartel, franchise, money-creating private banking machine to our proposal for a government issue, Federal Monetary Authority, stable, the Chicago Plan, the American Monetary Institute's, program, so that we can actually have stable money. When you come down to what the options are, what they should be, what caused the problem, how do we get out of it, what we really need to do is to make sure that we never again have the federal government paying interest on money that it can create itself.
Joe, I'm going to see you tomorrow in Chicago at the American Monetary Reform Conference. I want to remind you again to leave your questions and comments down below or come to our website at economicstability.org.